Good evening, gentlemen. Unfortunately, we are starting late this evening, which is particularly bad because as I was writing the summary for tonight's class, I was thinking that really the concept that we're about to start would best be taught in one 3-hour class rather than in 3 1-hour classes, as we're going to try and do it. But nevertheless, we will do the best with what we have. We're going to be on page 924 in the English when we start. We are holding in the middle of chapter 7 of the second part of Tanya, the Shaar HaYichud, the Alter Rebbe's treatise on the philosophy of Chabad, the Chassidic philosophy, specifically the theology of Chabad, on the nature of the world and the way in which the world does not exist and has no importance separate from God. The world has no reality separate from the divine. At this late stage in our studies, after all, there are only 12 chapters, and we've done most of chapter 7. In this late stage in our studies, we already know, of course, that the world is absolutely one with its source, that the world is nothing other than the divine speech which God uses to constantly speak it into existence. And furthermore, we also know that the world, not only is the world absolutely nothing within its source, but the source of the world is absolutely nothing within God. The source of the divine speech, the divine mouth, the trait of malchus, the divine trait of kingship, is absolutely and utterly united with God. And therefore, the world, number one, has no independent existence. It does not exist separate from God at all. And number two, it has no inherent importance. The world does not necessitate its own creation. There is no, the reality of the world does not inhere in the reality of God at all. It's not part of his reality. There is nothing that brings us to the conclusion that because God exists, the world must exist. There is no such thing. God exists. The fact that the world exists is purely on his desire. And what is it once it exists? Nothing other than him. So it has no inherent importance of its own, and it has no independent reality from him.
And the opposite sentence?
Which opposite sentence?
If the world exists, that means God exists?
That's something else entirely, right? That's something else entirely. Obviously, if the world exists, God exists. This is the classic explanation of God. That's a different point entirely. We're not here to argue for God's existence, which is presupposed by this work. In fact, this work is a terrible piece of argumentation in general, as we've mentioned several times, and we'll mention again tonight, that the Alter Rebbe's entire argument is based on emunah, is based on faith. We only agree with the Alter Rebbe because he has a tradition and Torah sources, and this is what the Torah tells him is true. He's not arguing to convince you of anything. So none of this is a logical argument, so to speak, although there are logical aspects, as we've explained before, so that the mind can also understand some of it. But largely speaking, the Alter Rebbe is telling us what the Torah says on these matters. Now, in chapter 7, we've said further that if the world does not exist apart from God, and the world has no importance, or there is no need for the world to exist at all, then number one, God has not changed in the creation of the world. Ani havaya lo shanisi, because since there is no potential, or no need, or no inherent divine faculty that is fulfilled by actually creating the world. Therefore, creating the world makes no difference to God. God hasn't changed. Number two, the creation of the world hasn't even changed God's knowledge, which is what we've been dealing with most recently. That God's knowledge of the creation is the same before the world is created and once the world is created. Because his knowledge is not, this is all review, by the way, so if it's going very quickly, it sounds...
Isn't God outside of time and space?
More on that in a moment.
So you're saying that his knowledge hasn't changed with the progress of time.
It's not just with it's not just with the progress of time, as we've discussed in our classes. It's even if the world is eternal, but consists of things which are different. For example, as we described it, if you have a universe with two things in it, you have a universe, and the entire universe is a kangaroo and an orangutan. So you would think that God has two different knowledges, because God creates the kangaroo and he creates the orangutan, both at every moment from absolute nothingness, and he is constantly and deeply involved in their creation, such that he is closer to the kangaroo and the orangutan than they are to themselves. Nevertheless, his involvement in this does not actually change his knowledge. He knows these two things that he creates exactly as he knows them before he creates them, because the division and the multiplicity in his knowledge does not derive from the thing that he knows. His knowledge is inherent to him. By being God, he knows everything. By knowing himself, he knows everything. As the Rambam describes, he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. What God knows, the mind that he knows it with, and God himself are all absolutely one. Yes?
So you said that the world is nothing in a sense where it's actually just all part of God, so it's not nothing, it's something within God that God just separated from himself.
It's nothing other than God, is what it is. Nothing other, nothing separate. It has no independent reality from God whatsoever.
Which means that it's just completely part of God,
yes.
So nothing means that it is there, but it's just part of God.
It is there, but all that it is godliness, correct. It has no independent reality.
Isn't the creation of the world like a kind of separated part from God? Like, in a sense, he has to downgrade the holiness of himself for us to be able to exist, right?
Well, let's look at tonight's class, and then we'll see if you have the same question at the end of tonight's class. Probably have more questions, but let's do tonight's class, and we'll see, because tonight's class is directly on the topic of didn't God actually change in the act of creation? So, we also mentioned last week, I should just mention for those who were here last week was almost more of a non sequitur in a sense, the whole class. But last week's class was about how in the service of God we are able to attain and act as if and truly serve God in such a way that the world has no independent reality from him whatsoever, at least at the level of Yichud Tata, at the level of the lower level unity. And the way this is possible is because even though we can't know God, we can know what we don't know, and we can picture even what we don't know, as we discussed last week, which is the language that the Alter Rebbe uses, that we are able, through knowing what we do not know, we are able to approach and even get a very vague sense of what God and his knowledge are, as we discussed last week.
We have to use our imagination.
What are you referencing to knowing what we do not know? What is what we don't know?
Unfortunately, you're going to have to go back and listen to last week's class. Unfortunately. All right. This week, we are beginning in the English in 924. In the Hebrew, we're starting with Vehine Mikan. And the whole chapter takes a turn. The Alter Rebbe is going into what appears to be a different topic, but we're going to see is actually deeply related to everything that we've learned so far. It's deeply connected with all the themes of this chapter, as we are going to see. Tonight's class is where this is where some people take their greatest joy. This is the juiciest part of the Tanya for some people, because we are getting into matters which are somewhat controversial. And to which I say that if this is the controversy that a person enjoys so much, they must be a very holy person, that they prefer this to debates in politics or any other sorts of arguments, because we're going to touch on a debate and a great disagreement among the rabbis today, and we're going to see that the matter that they disagree on is so abstract and so distant from, it would seem, from our daily lives, that we're actually going to have to work to try and truly understand this and truly grasp this. So, without further ado, let us read on 924. Vehine Mikan, says the Holy Alter Rebbe, from this we can see, from everything that we've said in chapter 7 so far, we arrive at the following. Yesh lahavin, we can begin to understand shigigas miktsas chachamim be'eneihem, the error of certain scholars in their own eyes. Hashem yechaper ba'adam, may God atone on their behalf. In other words, there are certain people who think that they're scholars and think that they're knowledgeable, and because of what they do, God needs to bring them atonement. In other words, what they have done in their mistake is a serious error. What is their error? Sheshagu v'ta'u be'iyunam be'kisvei ha'arizal. They erred and made a mistake in their study of the writings of the Holy Arizal. of the holy Ari, the Ari HaKadosh, who lived in Tzfas and is one of the primary, probably the greatest and most influential Kabbalist of all time, except perhaps Rav Shimon Bar Yochai himself. They made a mistake when they learned the Arizal. And what was their mistake? Vehevinu inyan hatzimtzum hamuskar sham kapshutai. They understood the matter of the tzimtzum, the matter of the contraction of the divine light that is written in the Arizal. They understood it literally. That was their mistake, for which God has to forgive them. May God forgive those scholars who understood, the scholars in their own eyes, who understood the Arizal to talk about a literal tzimtzum, a literal contraction of his light. What does this mean? To preface. L'chaim. The Alter Rebbe here is talking about the Arizal. The Arizal passed away in the year 1572 CE. The Alter Rebbe passed away, who knows when? He was fleeing Napoleon.
17.
No.
18, sorry.
1812.
Yes.
He passed away. The Alter Rebbe passed away in 1812, fleeing Napoleon. The Arizal passed away in 1572, to give you a sense of the time difference we're talking about here. So this is a few generations later, since the Arizal, right? A few centuries. 1572 to 1812.
2.5.
Yeah, call it 250 years or so. Now, what you may or may not know is that the Arizal taught for a very brief time in Tzfas, and it was an explosion of Kabbalistic knowledge. The Arizal taught, all told, probably for only 2 years in Tzfas, and in those 2 years, he revolutionized the understanding of Kabbalah and revealed new levels in the wisdom of Kabbalah that had never before been revealed. One of the new things the Arizal revealed, and the Arizal really... this idea is more revolutionary than it may first seem. The Arizal introduced the idea of what is called Tzimtzum Harishon, which means the original contraction of the divine presence, or the primordial Tzimtzum, the primordial contraction of the divine light. What does this mean? As we have mentioned before in this class, just as in Genesis, in Bereshis, at the beginning of the Chumash, there is a story of the creation, right, in the beginning, etc. So too, at the beginning of the Arizal's work, and we must keep in mind, as will become clear shortly, that the Arizal did not write down his own teachings. His teachings were written down by his students and were interpreted variously by his students. And the matter of interpretation here is important because that is the whole disagreement with which the Alter Rebbe is dealing here, the interpretation of the Arizal's words. But it's written in Eitz Chaim. It's written in the writings of the Arizal, which are really the writings of his students, primarily Rav Chaim Vital, who was his primary student. It says in the beginning of Eitz Chaim, the beginning of the Arizal's corpus, the most famous work, the primary work of Kabbalah of the Arizal, it tells the following story of creation. It says, in the beginning, there was God and his infinite light. And God's infinite light filled everything that there was to be filled. It filled all of reality. God then had a desire to create a universe, to create worlds, so he withdrew. He was mitzamtzem. He made a tzimtzum and withdrew his presence to the side. What is on the side of the? What is on the side? Very good question. The truth is, every word here there's very good questions on, and you can. It's probably
the word "and." You said
yeah.
God and his light.
Yes, absolutely. There's innumerable pages and seas of ink spilled on every word here. But the bottom line is God placed his presence on the side, and he took from the original light and emanated into the void and the empty space that was left from the contraction. He emanated a single ray, a kav, a ray of his light, and that ray is what created all of the worlds, that single ray of light. This is the Arizal story of creation. And in the Arizal story of creation, central to this story is this new idea that the Arizal revealed of a tzimtzum, a contraction in the divine presence, the part where God takes his presence and puts it on the side in order that a world should be able to arise, in order to make room for the world. Now, Obviously, first let's discuss what this means in the simplest sense. Obviously, when we say God's light had to be moved to the side to make room for the worlds, we do not mean this in a physical sense, right? The way in which you need to empty out a bag in order to put something new in it, right? Obviously, that's ludicrous. We're not talking about physical light. We're not even talking about physical universes at this juncture. None of this is physical. This all takes place on the spiritual domain. However, as we have spoken about in this class before, there is such a thing as spiritual space. For example, and this is key, this idea is key to understanding everything the Alter Rebbe is going to say further on this matter. For example, you have the idea of 2 + 2 = 4, right? The truth that 2 + 2 = 4. This is a spiritual truth and not a physical truth. One of the ways to distinguish between a spiritual truth and a physical truth is that it is not defined by physical time and space. Where or when is it true that 2 + 2 = 4? The answer is that it's a bad question. It's a bad question. 2 + 2 = 4 is not something that is bound by physical space, and it's not something that is bound either by time in the way that we're familiar with it. This truth is an eternal truth, at least as far as we can grasp, as far as truth goes, as we can define it. This truth is, let's call it, relatively eternal. The truth is relatively eternal compared to everything that's physical, right? We've discussed this in this class before in an earlier chapter. Everything that's physical comes into being, passes away, is defined by where it is and when it is, rather than being defined by itself. The spiritual is more real. The spiritual is eternal, it's immortal, and it is not defined by the rules of time and space. However, it is not the time and space that it's not defined by is physical time and space. There is, however, a spiritual space. What is the biggest proof that there is a spiritual place? The fact that 2 + 2 = 4 does not affect physical space. In other words, there is one realm for the physical, a different realm for the spiritual. They may interact in certain senses, but the fact is that 2 + 2 = 4 certainly is not affecting the physical realm everywhere that it is present in the spiritual realm. For example, when a human being understands that 2 + 2 = 4, you could say that his physical brain and the spiritual truth that 2 + 2 = 4 actually interact in some sense, which is one of the great mysteries of how the spiritual can interact with the physical. This is a mystery not just of the physical sciences, who have absolutely no clue, but the spiritual sciences as well. This is called ultimately one of the great miracles, that the spiritual soul can affect the physical body, which is the mafli lasos, the wondrous power to put these two things together that we refer to every time we say Asher Yatzar, just by the way. Anyway, so a human being's brain that understands 2 + 2 = 4, you could say that 2 + 2 = 4 affects the physical. But in a rock, does 2 + 2 = 4 affect the physical matter of the rock? And the answer is absolutely not. Why is that the case? Because clearly 2 + 2 = 4 has a limited domain in which it is true. There is such a thing as a spiritual space, a spiritual tchum, a boundary, a border in which spiritual realities exist. So you have physical things which exist in a physical reality, defined by a physical time and space. You have spiritual things which exist in a spiritual reality, defined by a spiritual time and space. And this is true not just of ideas, but of all spiritual things, right? For example, there is a divine blessing and a spiritual power given to plants that they should grow, right? Which distinguishes them from inanimate matter. There is a power of growth in plants, that the cells replicate. They are alive in a real sense, right? They continually are growing and they're not inert. They reproduce, right? They grow. A rock, on the other hand, does not have this power. This is a sign that the spiritual power of growth that God puts in a plant also has a has a limited definition. Not everything is affected by this growth. Some things are, some things aren't. There is a spiritual realm, there is a physical realm. Even when they interact, right, that just shows you where the border is, where they interact.
Do they exist alongside each other? Like,
well, you would say alongside each other, but even to say alongside each other is metaphorical, right? Because alongside implies some greater space which encompasses both, right? Which isn't really, which it's debatable whether such a thing is really true.
but does it,
right?
like, are they just within each other?
Where is 2 + 2 = 4? If you answer me that, I'll tell you whether they're within each other.
Well, can't you also, wait, it depends like what you're calculating, what is the question.
But where is it if no one ever calculates anything? If I have a universe where the whole universe is a hydrogen molecule, a hydrogen atom, sorry, where is 2 + 2 = 4? Right. And the answer is, it's here and it's not here. In other words, it doesn't exist in the physical universe, is the bottom line. It exists in a spiritual universe.
Does that spiritual universe, is it more of like an alternate reality that exists alongside of our own? Is it like heaven or whatever that is perceived to be above us? You know, like it's like what exactly, is it like, is the spiritual space around us right now and we just can't access it because we're physical beings? Like, or is it just completely above us and galaxies away?
If the spiritual place were above us, wouldn't that indicate that we're conceiving of the spiritual in physical terms? In other words, it's actually that I think of it as above,
below, within, without.
There's the 6 directions of physical space simply don't apply there. They don't apply, at least not in the same way they do in the physical world.
But
right?
then,
so it's everywhere.
How does it interact? If it's completely separate from the physical, how does it's not really complete. It's not really completely separate. They meet. The two of them meet. There are meeting points. Really, they're not completely separate. The two are actually very much interwoven. But the point I'm trying to make is that even when they're interwoven, they're clearly not interwoven everywhere. It's not that 2 + 2 = 4 is a physical fact that interact. Right? A baseball is a physical fact. I throw the baseball at your head, you would feel the impact. 2 + 2 = 4 is not a physical fact. Whatever it is that allows things in this reality to interact with the abstract concept that 2 + 2 = 4, it is clearly not the same as what allows them to interact with a baseball. That's all I'm saying. Now, so there is such a thing as physical space. There is such a thing as spiritual space. Now, given that this is the case, there is a disagreement about the nature of God's infinite light from the story of the Arizal. Again, the story of the Arizal, very shortly, is that there was God and his infinite light which filled everything. In order to make place for the worlds, God removed his infinite light. Now, here's the question. The question is, what is the nature of this infinite light? There are those who say that this removal was literal, and there are those who say that the removal of the light is a non-literal concept of the Arizal. In other words, when the Arizal says it, he doesn't mean it in the simplest sense of his words. Let's understand the position of the people who say the light was literally removed. The people who say the light was literally removed say as follows. They say that once upon a time, there was only one type of space and only one type of time. There was only one reality. The one reality and one type of thing that there was God and his presence. God and his presence, God and the fullness of his being, if you wish to use a more subtle language.
You keep saying and.
Yes, it's one. It's not two. We'll get into how it's two later. But for now, let's say it's one. So you have God.
Equals two.
I'm being intentionally vague because as we shall see, this debate is to try and get to the core of what this actually means, which is part of the whole discussion. So you have God and his presence, and I know it sounds like I'm listing two things, but let's, for our purposes, keeping it simple, call them one thing. So you have God and his presence, and that is the only type of thing that something can be. There is no room for a 2 + 2 = 4, which exists in one type of space. There is no room for a baseball, which exists in a different type of space. The only type of space that there is the God type of space. And that's the space that God's presence takes up, so to speak. Again, keeping in mind that we are not to think of this physically in any way. right? We're speaking of when we say there's no room for anything else to exist, we mean much more something like there's no room for that kind of speech in our synagogue. That's more what we mean for there's no room, right? There's no room for anything else to exist because the only type of thing that can be is the presence of God. Just like there's not enough room in a 10-gallon jug for 11 gallons of water, right? To use a very coarse physical mashal. There's no room. There's only one type of thing. The set of all possible things has only one member. The only thing that there can be is God. And there's no room, therefore there's no room for anything else to exist.
Then why is it a contraction?
Because he
because
he contracts and removes.
But if he doesn't literally contract and remove, so what's the action that he's doing?
No, we're talking about him literally doing it, first of all. Second of all, we'll get to that.
Remember that the students
thought that it was literal.
Thought it was a literal thing.
He removes his infinite light, so there is room for a creation to arise. So again, his infinite light is something that takes up a certain type of space. It's the only type of space that exists. He removes his infinite light, and now other types of spaces can arise. And then, when he emanates the kav, the single beam of light, to create the universe, it is able to create spiritual and physical realities other than the reality of his infinite truth, his infinite light. Okay? That's tzimtzum k'pshutoi. Tzimtzum in the literal understanding, the literal withdrawal of the light. He withdraws his presence so that other types of space may arise, spiritual spaces, physical spaces, etc. The non-literal position, the non-literalist position in the contracting of his light, says that the light does not actually go anywhere. He does not actually remove his presence. All he does is allow his experience, his presence to become hidden from a reality other than himself. In other words, his infinite light remains exactly as it was before. What is the tzimtzum? The tzimtzum is that something can now arise which perceives that that light is not here. That's the non-literal interpretation. So literal interpretation, the light is literally gone. All of this is more complicated than I'm explaining it right now, as we will see, as I will explain as it comes up. This is the easiest introduction to the topic. So the literal interpretation is he literally removes his light, and a universe may arise, other types of space.
A separate existence.
The non-literal interpretation is that his light remains, his infinite light is always here. All that happens, in other words, is here right now. We are within his infinite light right now, sitting here. In all realities is his infinite light, because it is truly infinite, meaning to say that it exists and can be at all levels and in all things. This is the non-literal interpretation. The only thing is that he has hidden it from us so that we have the impression that we are separate from him. And it's really not just us, it's all worlds and all levels, all spiritual worlds and the physical world perceives itself to be independent of God and perceives itself to have its own reality, and there to be something here other than his infinite light. So it's a question of, did he literally remove it, or did he make it seem, did he allow the perception to arise that he removed his light? This is what the whole debate is about, and let me tell you, this debate, or at least this debate, was used in the purpose of literally spilling blood at one point in history. This was a fierce debate. This was a debate originally, in the original generations of Chassidim. The opponents of Chassidus, one of their objections to Chassidus is that they objected to this idea that the contraction of the light is non-literal. which is going to be the Alter Rebbe's position. The Alter Rebbe's position and the position of Tanya, as the Alter Rebbe will explain, is that the Tzimtzum is non-literal. God's divine light is literally here everywhere. It is never removed. His infinite light, we only perceive it as if it has been removed.
Was this the Baal Shem Tov's
Opposed, one second. As opposed to the Alter Rebbe, there were many opinions. Such as the Yashar Levov and Rav Yonasan Eibshitz and the Holy Vilna Gaon were all of the opinion that the Tzimtzum is literal. His light was literally removed. These are all sages of the Alter Rebbe's generation and earlier. Some of them, the Yashar Levov is one of the students of the Arizal, I believe.
Who introduced the word Tzimtzum?
The Arizal. The Arizal introduced the word Tzimtzum.
At what
At what year? Well, the Arizal passed away in 1572. Before then.
And in that case, the Oren Sof was the inventor of that term.
Pardon?
Who invented, the Oren Sof?
The Ramak didn't talk about Tzimtzum.
The Arizal introduced the concept of Tzimtzum to Kabbalah as we have it nowadays.
But the Oren Sof?
The Oren Sof, I believe, is older.
Otherwise, Tzimtzum without Oren Sof, it's like meaningless.
I mean, no, I don't. There's definitely never any Tzimtzum without Oren Sof. The question is whether there was Oren Sof without Tzimtzum in the study of Kabbalah, which I believe there was.
What was believed at the time of the first or second temple?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Was it thought that there was a Tzimtzum?
No, Kabbalah was not...
It's extremely difficult to know what the Kabbalists at the time of the Second Temple thought because their works have not really reached us, except for the Zohar.
But
of
wasn't
Rav
that
Shimon
also
Bar
much more
Yochai.
like in their face, like they're accessing the light that what like in some way more than we are.
In
Because
other words,
they
they were
have
of a higher spiritual level,
Right,
yes,
yeah.
but the thing is that we have no idea what they did because very little of it has reached us, right?
Right.
You have the ancient Kabbalistic Sefer, Sfarim, or Sefer Yetzirah, and Sefer HaBahir, and the Zohar. Those are the famous ones. And the fact is I'm not a Kabbalist, first of all. Second of all, I only know the Kabbalah that is directly relevant to Chassidus, and even that very little. But the bottom line is, as far as I understand in the study of Kabbalah, is that after you've learned the Arizal and you go back and you read the Sefer Yetzirah and the Sefer HaBayir and the Sefer HaZoyar, it is extremely difficult to understand them in any way other than the way in which the Arizal understood them. In other words, there may have been branching, and probably were, branching interpretations, branching understandings, but the bottom line is that there's a reason why all Kabbalah after the Arizal basically follows after the Arizal, because the Arizal came and he explained these esoteric texts which are extremely difficult to understand on their own, and he explained them in a consistent, provocative, and new manner, based on Ruach Kodshay, based on his holy insight. And he wasn't, in other words, the question of when it arose is really only a question of when was this revealed to the rest of us, right? When was this able to be put into words? The whole matter of the revelation, the successive revelation of the inner Torah over time is a fascinating question. But the general gist seems to be, especially from the Rebbeim of Chabad, with whose opinion I am most familiar, the explanation seems to be that a great sage and people with great insight into the inner Torah, generally speaking, must receive permission from on high to reveal the things that they know. And if they reveal things that they're not meant to reveal, it is to disastrous results. Extremely dangerous results. The Rebbe himself, sorry?
This is what Rabbi Akiva said. They need to be at a certain age in order to look at that.
Certain age, etc. But that's different. That's the study of the Kabbalah, which we are recklessly engaged in right now. Look at us.
Well, he's only today. But
I have a question for you.
It's not just age; it's also being married and also being extremely knowledgeable in the entire revealed Torah. So,
All of those are
in case you thought you'd escape with
Yes,
marriage or age,
With age, yes.
I'm not talking about learning Kabbalah. I'm talking about revealing Kabbalah and printing new ideas in Kabbalah. Is what I'm talking about. Not studying what came before.
I have a,
Yes.
maybe it's going to be answered with further learning, but
Yes.
I feel like I'm compelled to answer.
Yes.
So, it seems to me that the Alter Rebbe's argument with the literal interpretation is that if you have a literal interpretation, you have room for God creating something separate from himself.
We're going to see. We're going to see. We're going to see exactly. We're going to read the Alter Rebbe's objections.
Okay, so the question though,
yes.
that assumes that in other words, leaving room for something new to be created separate from God. I don't know if it's separate from God or separate from God's light, but in the version, in the, I guess, metaphorical version of Tzimtzum that the Alter Rebbe is kind of sticking to, I guess.
Yes, the non-literal version,
right,
yes.
Non-literal version. The perception seems to be a new thing that's created. The perception of, like, our lack of perceiving
That's
seems to be...
That's the contraction.
I understand.
Right.
But that contraction leads to a new thing, according to what I'm hearing.
We'll see. Let's study. Let's continue. Let's continue and see. That's the easiest way. That's the easiest way to do this. So you have a literal tzimtzum and a non-literal tzimtzum, a literal contraction, a non-literal contraction. The opponents of Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe is writing about people in his own time when he's talking about those rabbis who make a mistake in their understanding of this matter. This was a live issue among the great Kabbalists in the time of the Alter Rebbe.
It's an active thread.
The Alter Rebbe says that there are those who think that Tzimtzum was literal, that the light was actually removed to make room for a world. The Alter Rebbe says the light is never removed, the light is still here. Now, let's continue reading. Let's continue reading. Let's see what the Alter Rebbe says. Page 925. Page 925. What do they think? Because the Alter Rebbe here will summarize the view that in his view that in his opinion is mistaken. The view that the Tzimtzum is literal. This is how he summarizes the view. He says, "She'akadosh Baruch Hu silek atzmei umehusay chas v'shalom me'elam hazeh." That the Holy One, blessed be He, removed Himself and His essence, God forbid, from this world. From this world. Rak shemashgiach milamayla ba'ashgacha pratis al kol yetzurim kulam, and that He merely guides from above with individual divine providence all of the various creations in our world. This is the mistaken view, in the view of the Alter Rebbe. God's presence is not here. God's infinite presence has withdrawn from this reality. There's a tzimtzum which is literal. His infinite presence is not here. He merely guides and is aware of everything that happens in the world from a distance. I believe the metaphor given in one sefer is like a king looking out the window of his palace at the dung heap below, right, into the lavatory below his palace. So God, the infinite reality of the Creator, is separate, is removed, says the Alter Rebbe, God forbid, chas v'shalom, from this world. God merely looks at this world, knows everything that takes place within it, and directs it from a distance, right? First of all, the first thing to note from this statement is, number one, that the opponents of the non-literal Tzimtzum, in other words, the people the Alter Rebbe is describing, right, are not people who... The disagreement is on the finest point of what they're talking about here. In other words, these are people who believe in the existence of God, that God constantly creates the universe, that God is involved and directs what takes place in the universe, that God is aware of everything that takes place in the universe. The only question is does He do it at a distance, like a king in his tower, looking at the world from a distance, so to speak? Or is He present within the world? And in fact, this is the reason why there were so many vociferous opponents to the Alter Rebbe's position. In other words, why did the Vilna Gaon and the other sages mentioned find the idea of a non-literal tzimtzum as an interpretation of the Arizal? In general, in Judaism, we're relatively quite flexible about interpretations, usually, right? Depending on the context and whether we have a tradition, etc. But generally speaking, if someone wants to come and say, right, Rashi reads the Gemara one way, Tosfos reads it another way, it's a different shita, a different opinion, right? And you can still hold that the other opinion is wrong and hold by your opinion. You don't have to say that the other people that hold it are going against the whole Judaism, right? They have a different interpretation. They have a different interpretation in the meaning. Why was it so we would say in Yiddish, abgefragt. Why was it so
Crucial.
No, the opposite. Why was it so impossible? Why was it so impossible for them to conceive? Why was it totally out of bounds to have a non-literal tzimtzum? In other words, for God's infinite presence to be here right now. And the answer, quite simply, it was rhetorical, but go ahead, no, please.
Well, isn't that like, it's just implicating idolatry, to believe something that is separate from God?
Not idolatry per se, because still God is the only one you would worship, obviously. You're not, it's not a what's it called? It's not a pantheism either. It's not saying everything is God. It's simply saying that God's infinite presence is here. God's presence is here, it's everywhere, right? The real problem is actually not idolatry. The problem is in God's honor and God's glory. Because frankly, if you say that the Tzimtzum is non-literal, that God's presence is everywhere, you are literally saying that God is present in a toilet.
Exactly.
Are you not? You're literally saying that God is present in a toilet or a trash can.
He created everything.
What? He created, but the disagreement is, sure he created, but he remained infinite, above the world, right? And the world as a creation is not within his infinite presence. His infinite presence is removed from the world. Therefore, a toilet is completely disgusting. I don't have to say my God is present in a toilet.
But why does that affect the spirituality of it?
What do you mean?
Because disgustingness is physical. So why is something like that? God is the garbage that is in, like he is. I mean, like the old.
See,
God forbid.
See the problem. This is
if you break down like what's in the garbage, then like God is a part of everything that is being in that garbage. Like like the food, the
That's an extremely controversial position. See, you live in a world that is soaked with Chassidus. You don't appreciate you don't see where these great rabbis, to whom we do not amount to the dirt under the toenail of the mosquito who's under the toenail of these rabbis.
I think it's also important to put it into context. Toilets were not even.
It doesn't really. That doesn't matter.
So no, because it's even grosser. It's even more disgusting.
It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. It's not about the. It's not about the toilets.
No,
it's not about the toilets, gentlemen. It's about the. It's about the.
I'm just saying. It's just.
Anything disgusting, anything lowly that a person might think about, God's presence is there, right? Which is an extremely, which appears to be a great affront to the Creator. Though, as the Alter Rebbe will explain, and as we will see, all is not as it seems on that front. This is not really the case. The Alter Rebbe, though in technical terms you may be able to say that God is present in the toilet, it is not in the way that this is a great affront, and this is a great degradation to God's name, as the Alter Rebbe will argue. And the truth is that this was the main criticism. The main criticism of this idea is that God's presence is everywhere, even in places where you would think it is not becoming to put God's presence in. How can you respect a God who is in such lowly places? That's point number one from the Alter Rebbe's description. The second point, which is very interesting, is that the Alter Rebbe says, why did they make their mistake? Because they made a mistake in studying the Arizal, which is interesting, because, as we are about to see, the Alter Rebbe's argument for the non-literal Tzimtzum is rational. He's not going to cite a proof from the Arizal, that the Arizal clearly says here and here that the Tzimtzum is non-literal. That is not what the Alter Rebbe is going to do. The Alter Rebbe is going to provide two reasons why this interpretation is incorrect philosophically, so to speak. Why the interpretation of his opponents is simply wrong. What the Alter Rebbe is hinting to here, by the fact that it's a misinterpretation of the Arizal, is that the Alter Rebbe must have, by tradition, and this answers Ronnie's question from earlier, the Alter Rebbe must have, by tradition, a tradition from the Maggid, his teacher, who got a tradition from the Baal Shem Tov, his teacher, who also studied student after student from students of the Arizal. They must have a tradition that this is what the Arizal meant. In other words, because as we've already seen in Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, who remembers the earlier place where we say that proofs from reason can't be brought on God, that you can't say that God has to do anything logically? Does anyone else remember where we spoke about this earlier?
I remember speaking about it.
We said, why does the Alter Rebbe bring the proof from the splitting of the sea when there's other proofs that are much more common in our day-to-day experience for the idea that he's explaining over there? And we said that because you cannot prove anything about God from day-to-day experience, since God can do anything, who says that he obeys the laws of logic as you understand them? Who says that he follows the rules and follows the understanding that you have, right? So too here, even though the Alter Rebbe is going to give a philosophical argument, he hints, why is his opponent wrong? Not because they gave the wrong philosophical argument, but because they misread and misstudied the Arizal. In other words, the Alter Rebbe must have a tradition from the Arizal that this is the correct way to understand the Arizal. The Alter Rebbe is not going to say the words of the Arizal that prove him right. There may not be words, but he has a tradition, teacher after teacher, student after student, going back to the Arizal, that this is the correct interpretation. Because obviously from logic and philosophy, you cannot bring any proof on what God did with the original Tzimtzum, right? Following his own principle that he uses elsewhere in Shaar HaYichud. Okay, let us continue and read further. We have so little time. Let us continue. The Alter Rebbe is going to say two reasons why. The Alter Rebbe is going to say two reasons why the Tzimtzum must be non-literal. The first reason is going to be because the Tzimtzum is otherwise a mikre haguf, which is a philosophical reason, as I will explain shortly. The second reason is because of something the Rambam teaches us. So there's a philosophical reason, and then there is based on the Rambam. Okay? Here's the two reasons. Let's read them inside. Okay, we read that. Last line of 925. Last line of 925. Vehine milvad in the Lashon HaKodesh. Vehine milvad she'i efshar klal lemer inyan hatzimtzum k'pshuto. Aside from the fact that it is absolutely impossible to say, philosophically speaking, it is illogical to say that the Tzimtzum is literal, shumim mikre aguf, because it is the literal Tzimtzum is ascribing. It ascribes a corporeality to God. And God is separate from all corporeality to an infinite, to an infinite and impossible to comprehend extent. This is the first reason the literal Tzimtzum is wrong. The first reason the literal Tzimtzum is incorrect is because philosophically, theologically, it's a problem. It is ascribing corporeality to God. It is ascribing him something like a body. How is this the case? How is this a case? Because, to wit, who remembers how we explained the literal Tzimtzum? We explained the literal Tzimtzum that there was only space for one type of thing, which is God's reality. God removed his reality to make room so that other types of space, other types of reality can arise. However, to say that God's infinite light leaves no room for the rest of the creation, in this sense, in the sense that it is a form of space and there is no space for anything else there, is to ascribe to God's infinite light, to God's infinite presence, a certain corporeality, a certain bodily quality. Why? Everything that exists in a space, everything that exists in some form of space is defined by that form of space. In other words, if a physical object no longer takes up space, it literally does not exist on the physical plane. If a physical object ceases to take up space, that means it doesn't exist. Everything physical takes up space. So too, in spiritual space, in a more refined sense, if something ceases to take up any spiritual space, it ceases to exist. Everything that exists in a space, whether it be physical or spiritual, is defined in terms of the space that it takes up, right? If there was no physical reality, if there was only a spiritual reality, you could not have a baseball. A baseball is defined by the physical reality, the physical space which it takes up. So too the opposite. If there was only a physical reality, which is impossible for me to imagine personally, but if there was only a physical reality, then the idea of 2 plus 2 equals 4 would take up no space and would not exist if there was only a physical reality. Everything that takes up a space is defined by and defined in terms by the thing that exists. God's infinite expression, God forbid to say it is defined in terms of any space. God forbid to say God's infinite expression is defined in terms of any space. Right? What geder, what definition, what tchum, what border could you put on God's infinite expression? Right? In other words, to put it differently, if the problem that the Tzimtzum is solving is that God's expression simply makes no room for anything else to be, in the spiritual sense, it takes up a spiritual space that nothing else can occupy, what you've done is you've said God's infinite expression really comes after the idea of spiritual space. The idea of spiritual space precedes and defines God's infinite expression. First, there is a spiritual space that one must occupy, and the space must come before whatever's in it, because if there's no space, then nothing can be in it, right? So first comes the spiritual space.
This is the incorrect assumption?
This is why the Alter Rebbe is saying the Tzimtzum K'pshuta is wrong. Tzimtzum K'pshuta, the literal Tzimtzum, is wrong because what they say is that God's infinite presence must be removed. The spiritual space must be emptied so that now other spaces can exist. Says the Alter Rebbe, the whole idea that God's presence takes up any kind of space in any sense implies that space as a concept, as a reality, as a defining reality, precedes God's infinite expression. In other words, what this means is that God has not yet created a thing which is infinite light should take space in, and yet we are saying that he must remove his infinite light for there to be space for anything else. It's a contradiction. What you're really saying is that God, it's making him not physical, it would at most be making him spiritual because there's spiritual space, but what you are is in a very abstract and in a very subtle way, you're saying that if God is present, something else can't be present because it takes up some kind of space. Which God forbid to say such a thing about God, that means that space precedes the divine reality. Space is here, even without his creating it.
Space defines the place.
Exactly, which means it precedes.
If you say that God's presence is ephemeral.
Is ephemeral.
Or spiritual.
Okay, spiritual.
Spiritual / ephemeral.
Yeah.
Then, if it's ephemeral, then it's possible to have perceived realities as we know them.
Okay.
Okay, and the space that we recognize as reality is dimensional.
Physical space.
Okay, doesn't necessarily compete in any way with what's ephemeral.
That's exactly what we're saying, but we're actually saying a step further. We're saying that the ephemeral also doesn't compete with what God is, because God is not ephemeral. For God, in other words, what we're saying is that if God is spiritual, right, in the sense that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is spiritual, say. If God is spiritual, that must mean that the spiritual space by which spiritual things are defined precedes God, which cannot be, says the Alter Rebbe. So when we say that God contracted his light, we are not saying that he is making spiritual space for a world to arise, because God forbid to say that God takes up even spiritual space. That is what the Alter Rebbe is saying.
But even the word as Tzimtzum, it's almost impossible by itself.
Why?
Because, I mean, you take infinite, no matter how much you try to conceal it or contract it, it's still going to be infinite. So
that's
how can
true.
you even do it?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Well, if you can explain how God can be infinite, I can explain how he can move the infinities to the side.
You know, it's easier to explain infinite than Tzimtzum.
But if you actually understand the way in which God is infinite, it's not easier to explain.
So
I
what is he
promise.
constricting? Ma'amet Tzimtzum.
What?
What Ma'amet Tzimtzum?
Well, in the future, as part of this 3-hour class, we'll discuss it. But let's say the second reason quickly. We're running out of time. We're going to go a little over. I hope no one is angry about the steak. Hopefully there'll be steak left. Continues the Alter Rebbe. What's the second reason? What's the second reason we can't hold of literal tzimtzum? The first reason is that it assigns a certain corporeality to God. It says that he exists within some kind of conceptual space, which cannot be true. God must precede all conceptual spaces. What does the Alter Rebbe say is the second reason? The second reason is, Af gam zois loy bedas yedaberu. Even without that argument, they are still not speaking wisely, says the Alter Rebbe at the top of 926. Because they, the people who believe that Tzimtzum is literal, are believers, the sons of believers. And what do they believe? That God knows all of the created beings in this lowly world, and he supervises over them. God is involved in the affairs of the worlds. And therefore, necessarily, his knowledge of them does not add to him any multiplicity or innovation. His knowledge of the world does not add to his knowledge, as we've been explaining the past few weeks. Because he knows everything by knowing himself. It is as if, as we've been saying these past few weeks, his essence and his being and his knowledge are all absolutely one. Top of 927. No, actually, let's stop. Let's leave it there. It's as if they're all absolutely one. In other words, and this is the connection to the chapter, for anyone who's been wondering what all of this has to do with what we've been learning so far, this is the connection. Given the idea that God and his knowledge are absolutely one, which all of the Alter Rebbe's opponents must agree to, for they all agree to the Rambam. These are all religious Jews. Everybody agrees this principle about the reality of God, that he and his knowledge are absolutely one. Given that this is true, they cannot argue that the Tzimtzum is literal, because their argument is that God's presence is withdrawn from the world, and he knows the world. How? How did we say he knows the world? He knows the world at a distance, like a king in a tower looking at the world. Says the Alter Rebbe, but if you really think about this other principle, of seemingly unrelated principle of Judaism regarding God's knowledge, which is that he and his knowledge are absolutely one, what is his knowledge of the world? What is his knowledge of the toilet or of the dung heap? His knowledge of it is absolutely one with him. He does not have a knowledge which is separate from him. In other words, it is impossible. The metaphor does not match the thing that it's a metaphor for. The analogy does not match the analog. A physical king of flesh and blood can sit on his tower and never see anything disgusting in his presence, and look out a window and see the world and see the dung heap. But God, whose knowledge is simply synonymous with himself, by knowing the dung heap, he must therefore be in the dung heap. He knows nothing other than himself. His knowledge is absolutely united with him. So if the opponents of the Alter Rebbe agree that God is mashgiach, he does supervise and is involved in human affairs, and he knows everything that takes place in the universe, he's omniscient, and if they agree that his knowledge is absolutely one with him, then what is accomplished even by the argument that the Tzimtzum is literal? They are trying to say that God is removed from the world and he knows the world at a distance. Says the Alter Rebbe, that's a human knowledge. That's a human knowledge. The idea that he can know something at a distance is to apply a human knowledge to God. God's knowledge, he knows everything by knowing himself. He doesn't know at a distance. He doesn't know at a distance. If his knowledge is in this embarrassing place, then so is he.
Then doesn't that draw in the question of what's the point?
What's the point of what?
Of creating something that doesn't add to himself?
What do you mean?
Whatsoever.
Oh. That's the purpose of why he did this place. He wanted to find.
But it doesn't. If nothing is,
it's very good. It's very good. As I tell the other students of
the purpose of the change.
As I tell the other students of the class every week, the purpose of this class is so that you can ask that question harder. In other words, if you come out of the class wondering why should God even create a universe, that's a very good thing, very healthy.
And the answer is very simple. Just because he wanted. Period.
Thank you. You saved Eyal's good. Eyal knows the answer by now. He's saving us some time. Everywhere his knowledge is, he is as well. A different principle of Judaism, which the Alter Rebbe beautifully brings to bear on this idea. So why is the Alter Rebbe talking about the Tzimtzum loy kapshuta, the non-literal Tzimtzum, which again we will talk about much more and explain much more in the coming weeks? Why is he talking about it here? Because now that he has shown us the full depth of what it means, that his knowledge doesn't change just because the world is created, because all he really knows is himself, this is the answer to the opponents of the Alter Rebbe who say that the Tzimtzum is kapshuta, that he knows the world and yet is somehow separate from it. Says the Alter Rebbe, there is a different principle of Judaism, that he and his knowledge are one, which says that he is wherever his knowledge is. So if he is involved in the world, he must perforce be in the world.
Do those opposing factions still believe that to this day?
Believe what?
That the Tzimtzum is to be taken literally?
You may run into one or two very, very interesting people who still believe that the Tzimtzum is taken literally. As far as I know, most people nowadays who study, who are conversant with these subjects, believe that the Tzimtzum is non-literal. In fact, the very famously, the Vilna Gaon's prime student, his great Talmud, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, in his Sefer, the Nefesh HaChaim, agrees with the Alter Rebbe, not with his teacher, the Vilna Gaon, as does Rav Nachman of Breslov when he talks about these concepts, and many others. So I don't know actually whether there are people nowadays who are active in Kabbalah who believe that Tzimtzum is literal. I don't know. As far as I'm aware, I haven't heard of any or know of any, but that's actually not saying very much. Now, this itself, and we'll finish with this argument that the Alter Rebbe is making, that his knowledge and him are absolutely one, so everything that he knows, he is present there in what he knows, right? This very argument shows why, in the first place, it shows why the question in the first place of how can God be in a toilet is a question based on a misunderstanding, right? Because in what sense does he know everything? Because the sense in which he knows everything is the same sense in which he is present in everything, right? Because they're the same. His knowledge and his presence are identical. Right. So in what sense does he know everything? As we explained 2 weeks ago, in the same sense that being able to throw a baseball means I can throw it in any dimension that is created. Right? This is our metaphor from 2 weeks ago. In the sense that it doesn't add anything to my ability to throw a ball if there is a new dimension along which I can throw it, because it is inherent to my ability to throw that I'm able to throw in every dimension. So too, God knows everything as an inherent part of his knowledge. His knowledge does not begin imperfectly and grow like a human knowledge, but rather is absolutely perfect, and he knows everything inherently even before he creates it, just like I can throw a baseball in any direction even before the direction is invented, right? This has been a metaphor. So in what sense is God found in the toilet? Right? In what sense is God actually found in the toilet? The answer is only in as much as the toilet exists. And to what extent does it exist? Obviously it doesn't, because he has not changed and his knowledge has not changed. His knowledge of the toilet before he created it is exactly the same as his knowledge of the toilet after he creates it. Right? God is the same God before it's created and after it's created. In other words, what is accomplished by saying, what is the big issue with saying that God is present in the toilet? The real answer to that question is of how can you say God is present in a toilet is what's a toilet? If you can explain to me what a toilet is, right? The Alter Rebbe would explain to you over 6... Yeah. Well, what it is in reality, right?
That's the same question. What is this table? It's
the exact same. In other words, there's no difference between a toilet and a table, which is exactly what we're saying. Right. That's what it means, that his knowledge doesn't change. That's what it means, that his knowledge is absolutely one, that there is no difference, right? In other words, you could put God in a palace or you could put him in a toilet. The fact is, it doesn't make any difference because he's God. He's above the distinction, right?
But then why is it degrading to make that distinction?
What do you mean?
If we just established that the toilet in and of itself makes no difference to God's knowledge,
yeah,
then why is it degrading to make a distinction that God is in the toilet?
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's not. It's not degrading.
So it's not.
God is everywhere.
Doesn't mean we should.
God is everywhere.
degrading.
What?
But it
No,
is
God is everywhere. God is everywhere. In what sense is God everywhere, though? In other words, God is everywhere. God is in the toilet. The question is, what does that mean? We say it's degrading because it seems like it's an inappropriate place, right? From our perspective, being within the created world and knowing what a toilet is and knowing what a palace is, it's better that God should be in the palace or better that he should be outside of the world than in the world, right? To take us out of the toilet speak here for a moment, to try and raise ourselves up a little. It's my fault. It's my fault. It's my fault, really. So in what sense, you missed the whole thing. What can you do? In what sense is God in such places, though? In what sense is he in an inappropriate place or a dirty place or a disgusting place, right? He can only be in the place to the extent that the place exists, and the place does not exist separate from him at all. Right? The whole geder, the whole definition of a place as a dirty place, right? You're not allowed to say words of Torah in the bathroom, right? The whole question is what does that mean? What does that mean? It's not because this place is a place that's more distant from God. Essentially, nothing is more distant from his infinite light. His infinite light is everywhere. Everything that he creates is everything that he knows, is everywhere that he is. There's no distinguishing between all these things, right? So what is the problem with speaking words of Torah there? The problem is that God says, I don't want you to speak words of Torah there. In other words, God, even though this is the true reality of these places, God nevertheless, there is something about the created order of time and space, with all of its distinctions of quality and all of its distinctions of higher and lower, that a palace is a nicer place than an outhouse, etc., right? All of these distinctions, for some reason, God has decided that they matter, and he has decided that we should live our lives according to these distinctions. But the distinctions are not inherent, in other words. The distinctions between these two places, how can the distinction between an outhouse and a throne room truly exist if, number one, neither of these things make any difference to him, and number two, neither of them have any inherent importance? He didn't need to create a palace, he didn't need to create an outhouse. So what can fundamentally the difference be? It's not, I wouldn't say it's more complicated than that. It's not so simple. It's not only for our benefit. It depends what you mean by only for our benefit. Let's put it that way. It depends what you mean. There's lots of subtle gradations in that. I would very broadly agree, but I think that my agreement could be misunderstood. So I'll withhold agreement. But it's complicated is the answer to that question. In a sense, it's only for our benefit. In another sense, it's actually not for our benefit at all. It's actually only for his benefit in a different sense. The question is how can anything be of benefit to him that has no actual reality in his eyes? And the answer is because that's what he desired totally irrationally, right? So it's complicated. But well,
if you don't have gradations,
yeah,
then how can you connect through your soul, as we talked about last week,
yeah,
to a greater understanding of God? We need gradations.
We need gradations, but the truth is that we could have been created in a way where we don't need gradations. Theoretically, why not? In other words, yes, you're right, but that's only because he's created it this way. Why he could have created it a different way, theoretically. In other words, these matters are very complicated, and we will continue, God willing, next week, continuing exploring these complicated matters. But I just wanted to point out to you at the end here that really the whole accusation that God is found in a disgusting place, it really misses the whole point. The whole point is that once you understand that the disgusting place is itself absolutely nothing other than God and totally one with God, right? The question is why should this distinction be so important, right? The fact that he's everywhere is the primary fact. The fact that he can't be here is really not so troubling because it's the same as everything else. There's no difference between God being in a palace and God being in an outhouse in that sense. Okay.